So I'll say welcome again. My name is Errol Lewis. I'm a columnist and an editorial board member of the New York Daily News, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation, The Promise of Freedom, Is America on Course? Co-sponsored by Demos, the Donald and Paula Smith Family Foundation, and Cato Institute. We have two speakers who will bring forward some notions about freedom that go a little bit beyond what we normally see talked about in the course of political campaigns. The midterm elections that just completed were really marked by unusually bitter partisan wrangling, and words like freedom got tossed around somewhat loosely. We're going to try and put some shape to that concept, to dig a little bit deeper, and to question whether or not freedom is still a relevant notion or an idea. Is it still something we need to thrash around? Freedom and its near cousin, liberty, are cited in almost every single speech that President Bush gives. It's cited as part of the reason the United States is in Iraq. It's cited as part of the reason the tax code is how it is or how it should be changed. We're going to sort of, again, go a little deeper and see what all of that means. Our first speaker is going to be John Schwarz. He's a distinguished senior fellow at Demos and professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Arizona, where he's been on the faculty since 1970. He's the author of Freedom Reclaimed, Rediscovering the American Vision. And that new book, it was published last year, that book is sort of the core and the starting point of tonight's discussion, although we'll go well beyond that as well. Mr. Schwarz has published 5 books, and articles of his have appeared in every major professional journal in political science, as well as in many outlets for the general public, including the Atlantic Monthly, the New Republic, The Nation, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. His prior book, Illusions of Opportunity, The American Dream in Question, was entered in nomination for the Pulitzer Prize in 1998. Also joining us tonight is David Boaz, Executive Vice President at the Cato Institute. He's played a role in the development of the Cato Institute and the libertarian movement. He's a provocative commentator and a leading authority on domestic issues such as education choice, drug legalization, the growth of government, and the rise of libertarianism. He's the author of Libertarianism, a Primer, described by the Los Angeles Times as a well-researched manifesto of libertarian ideas. He's also the editor of the Libertarian Reader and co-editor of the Cato Handbook on Policy. Mr. Boaz is the former editor of the New Guard magazine and was executive director of the Council for a Competitive Economy prior to joining Cato in 1981. He too has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a host of other journals and general interest publications. John Schwarz is going to talk to you for about 10 minutes. David Boaz will then follow for about 10 minutes. And after that, they'll each have a chance to rebut each other's observations and arguments. And then we'll go into a general discussion. Thank you for being here.
Hello. It's a privilege to be here this evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank Demos, the Cato Institute, and the Smith Family Foundation. Thank you, Mr. Boaz, for debating with me, and thank you, Mr. Lewis, for moderating. And thank you all for being here this evening. What's at stake in this discussion is the future direction of our country. What the promise of America is in the coming decades, who we are as a nation, whether we are fulfilling the vision that the founders had for this country. We are here to talk about the idea of freedom, America's most basic value, about which Thomas Paine rightly said, "The sun has never shone on a cause of greater worth." For this reason, it's good that this evening we have here tonight a liberal, the perspective that I represent, and a libertarian, Mr. Boaz. I take freedom to mean much the same thing as liberty. And as is evident from the very names, liberalism and libertarianism are each rooted in the idea of liberty, which is not the case for conservatism. Because liberalism and libertarianism both focus on the idea of freedom, they actually think alike on many issues, which is contrary to common impression, and is something I'll touch on more later in the discussion that follows our opening remarks. For now, I would say only that in many of these areas of agreement, the nation has been heading disturbingly away from the principles of freedom, such as with the growing tie between religion and public policy, the taking of private property for purposes that are not really public, undertaking warrantless surveillance of Americans, and engaging in wars of choice, to give a few examples. Issues like these are much in the news today, and many liberals and libertarians are joined together in trying to turn these trends around. In the little time that I have for my opening remarks, I'm going to concentrate on a fundamental area where liberals and libertarians do not think alike, but fundamentally differ. It is an area where the nation has been heading in the wrong direction, seriously in the wrong direction, harming the lives of a great majority of Americans and absolutely violating their freedom, at least freedom as the founders and presidents like Lincoln and Roosevelt after them understood freedom. Yet amazingly, it is rarely ever cast in our political debate today as an issue of freedom. The general area I refer to is the economy, and more particularly, how most Americans and their families are doing in today's economy. Here, with respect to this matter, libertarians unite with many conservatives, not liberals, and literally turn the founders' vision of individual freedom upside down. Libertarians and conservatives take economic freedom mostly to mean the free market. Under the ascendant influence of the free market ideology over the past 3 decades, the nation's public policy has increasingly deregulated the free market and left it more on its own. What I will emphasize is that to equate the free market with the moral vision of freedom that inspired the founders and Lincoln and Roosevelt is to miss an essential dimension of their great vision of freedom, indeed a key dimension of the fundamental values that we all share. The founders' notion of freedom went way beyond a free market ideology whose ultimate goal is efficiency. The founders did not understand economic freedom as equivalent to the free market. For them, freedom starts with the transcendent premise of the dignity of every human being. Because each human has dignity, fundamental, inherent dignity, each person must be an end of his or her own choosing, never simply a means to the ends of others. Let me say that again. Each person must be an end of his or her own choosing, never simply a means to the ends of others. How does this play out in today's economy? As ends of their own choosing, as free persons, it follows that each person and not someone else should receive the fruits of his or her own labor. Gaining the full product of one's labor is a basic right of every person who is truly free. There is no doubt that this principle was the founders' firm and fundamental belief. This principle was once alive and well in our country. It used to be that the pay of American workers rose as the level of their productivity and the quality of their work increased in nearly a one-to-one fashion. But that is no longer the case, and it hasn't been for more than 3 decades now. Since 1973, over the past 33 years, there has been a 75% growth in the productivity of American workers and virtually no change in their compensation. About half of that increase in productivity is attributable to the workers themselves and not to technology, and still there has been no increase in real pay. The gap between the rising productivity attributable to the workers themselves and their frozen pay has grown year by year for more than 30 years. The gap now exceeds $13,000 per year for a typical working family, money they should have earned but have not been paid. Think about it. The accumulation of money lost over those 3 decades for the typical working family now amounts to more than $200,000 that they could have spent or have put in the bank today. A veritable fortune, and it's unconscionable. Because of the loss of compensation they have sustained, most families today are having to work longer hours than they did before just to keep up. They feel increasingly stressed and overstretched. They cannot save, and it has become much more difficult to get ahead. That's not freedom. And that's a main reason why so many Americans believe that the country is headed in the wrong direction, and a reason why Americans voted the way they did 1 week ago. What broke the historic connection between productivity and pay increases for American workers is the abandonment of the founders' vision of freedom in favor of a free market, do-it-yourself approach. Remember, the goal of the free market is efficiency in bringing together supply and demand, not freedom. As a result, except for the very strongest, an unregulated free market will end up reducing workers' pay even if workers do a better job whenever labor is in great surplus and easy to get. And that's exactly what has happened in our country. The past 3 decades have witnessed a mounting surplus of labor in our nation. It came from the mass of baby boomers and their children, as well as increasing numbers of wage earners in most families and rising immigration. Together, all these workers flooded the labor market to overflowing. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the number of new workers entering into our labor market suddenly exploded, more than doubling. It happened overnight, and it continued for decades. The continuous swelling of the supply of labor year after year meant that pay for workers would remain virtually stagnant throughout the past 3 decades, except in the cases of the very strongest, those in top management, whose pay has gone through the roof, soaring by 300%. The pay has not gone abroad because of global competition. During an age where workers were gravely weakened economically by their huge numbers, nearly all of the compensation increases for workers' better productivity have been siphoned off from them and have gone mostly to top management and to profits, completely in opposition to the principles of freedom. In a vision where the sacred aims of freedom are foremost, the unfettered free market does not and often cannot do the job. To really deal with the problem I am talking about, it's going to take governmental action. In order to maintain a society in which the moral value of freedom stays in the fore and defines our policy and who we are, we need to act together as a society. Government is the way we join to solve problems of freedom collectively that can't be solved by private interests alone. So instead of reducing regulation and starving government as libertarians advocate, a moral vision of freedom would lead to policies such as increasing the minimum wage, raising the earned income tax credit, and implementing and promoting the expansion of collective bargaining to help pay keep up with productivity. It would also involve policies such as extending health care coverage to the uncovered and making coverage more affordable, increasing aid to education, wage insurance, and other similar liberal initiatives. Each of these proposals aims to help lift the overall return to workers closer to their improved contribution, very much in keeping with the most fundamental moral principles of freedom. The same policies would enable every family to gain at least a living wage and health insurance so that all workers and families are truly able to live in dignity. With respect to Americans' economic well-being and many other areas, as I suggested at the start, the nation in the recent past has been retreating from time-honored principles of freedom. The 2008 election provides us an opportunity to sketch out a new vision for the country, a vision grounded in the ideal of freedom. So far tonight, I've had time to describe a vision of freedom as it applies to the key area of economic opportunity. There's a lot more to say about other areas too. In the area of economic opportunity, to close, the conservative and libertarian free market ideology of freedom falls way short of the moral principles of freedom that inspired the founders, gave birth to the nation, and are still deep within us today. It totally misses what our country is about. Liberals understand what freedom is, as I have attempted to demonstrate in the area of economic opportunity, and hope to do with other areas in the discussion to come. Again, thank you for being here.
Good evening, and thank you to the Donald and Paula Smith Foundation for making this evening possible. Professor Schwarz and I agree that freedom is the fundamental idea in America. But he says freedom requires massive transfers of resources and massive government bureaucracy. Perhaps at a more fundamental level, he says that freedom requires other values to be genuine freedom. And I say that freedom is the framework within which we pursue our other values. Freedom is not the only value in our lives. It's the highest political value, but it's not by any means the only value. It may not even be the highest value. For you, the highest value may be love, compassion, friendship, achievement, financial success. Those are all values. Freedom is the framework within those values can be pursued. And to some extent, it's an issue of semantics. There are many values, so let's give them all different names. Ice cream and fried chicken are both great, but it wouldn't help us communicate if we called ice cream fried chicken. So I think it's a serious confusion to call control over resources, to call money, to call a good income freedom. We have a very good word for control over resources. It's wealth. Let's reserve freedom to mean the right of the individual to make his own decisions without force or fraud imposed on him by others. I think a more fruitful way to look at this is to talk about a presumption of liberty. Sometimes we may need government to act, but you have to make a case for that. You have to prove it. The presumption should be that people are free to run their own lives, and the burden of proof falls on those who want government to act. It is the exercise of power, not the exercise of freedom, that requires justification. We want to discover the rules that govern the world, the rules that will enable us all to live together and achieve those wonderful rights in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not the guarantee of happiness, the right to pursue happiness. And to achieve those goals, we need rules like private property, free markets, and tolerance. In fact, if you know that bestseller from a few years ago, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, well, you could say that you learn the essence of freedom, which is also the essence of civilization, in kindergarten. Don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep your promises. And if we all live by those rules, we will achieve a great and free society. Freedom, I think, has three key ideas underpinning it. One, the idea of individual rights, which we have as a person because we're people and not from the government or from any other source. Second, the idea of spontaneous order. This is a very hard concept for us to understand. It is especially hard for intellectuals to understand. Everything we do in our lives seems to require planning. Putting this event together requires planning. Running an organization requires planning. Creating a new software program requires planning. Just getting your kids to school in the morning requires planning. And yet, the most complex systems in our world are unplanned. They're spontaneous. Think about language. Nobody planned the English language. It evolved spontaneously. There are planned languages. You've never heard of them, like Esperanto. No one speaks them. People only speak unplanned, spontaneous languages. Law. A lot of people here think law is something made in Washington. Much of what's made in Washington is the very opposite of law. It is legislation to take money from some people and give it to other people, and that's the opposite of the fundamental law. Fundamentally, law, common law, evolved over many years. It evolved over disputes and how do we settle them fairly, and we came essentially to the rules of property and contract, but it was spontaneous evolution. Money. Money was not originally created by Alan Greenspan. It evolved as a unit of trade. And the economy. Everybody assumes the economy must be planned in some way. How could 8 million people get fed every morning? There are no farms in New York. And yet, no one plans it, and that's what makes it work. And in every economy where they tried to plan it, 8 million people didn't get fed every morning. That was the result. And third, limited government. As a result of these ideas, we want delegated, enumerated, and thus limited powers for the federal government. They're delegated because we had them first as individuals. They're enumerated in the Constitution, and they're limited by their enumeration in the Constitution. And I would suggest that many of the things that Professor Schwarz proposes and that other people propose are not allowed under the Constitution, even if they were a good idea. And part of the implication of all of this is a world of decentralization and competition and divided power, because power is what we have to fear. Power in one hand, power in the hands of a party, power in the hands of a state, maybe even power in the hands of the Republican Party. Now it's going to be divided, and that probably is a good thing. But when I talk about competition, I think too many people hear the word competition and they think antagonism, dog eat dog, cutthroat competition. And I think in talking about freedom, we need also to stress the important role that cooperation plays in a free society. A few years ago, when Charles Murray wrote a book on libertarianism, Charles Krauthammer, a great conservative intellectual, reviewed the book, and he said that until Charles Murray, the libertarian vision was, quote, a race of rugged individualists, each living in a mountaintop cabin with a barbed wire fence and a no trespassing sign outside. He also mentioned atomized individualists living in a castle with a moat. Another distinguished intellectual, E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post, wrote that I believe, that libertarians believe, that individuals come into the world as fully formed adults who should be held responsible for their actions from the moment of their birth. Who could believe that? Not me. But I think this canard is very damaging. I think people believe it, and it's a problem for understanding the free society. It is not news. E.J. Dionne wants us to believe he's telling us something we don't know. It is not news that human beings can barely survive and can hardly flourish alone. We want to interact with others. We need to interact with others. It is to achieve the benefits of interaction with others that individuals enter into society and establish a system of rights. In a free society, we have our natural rights as people and our general obligation to respect the rights of other individuals. But our other obligations are those that we choose to accept by contract. A mortgage, a marriage contract, any kind of contract creates rights and obligations, but you had a choice about whether to enter into that. And none of this is the kind of atomistic individualism that philosophers and professors like to deride. I don't know what atomistic individualism would mean in the modern world. Would it mean living in a house you built yourself? Wearing clothes you made yourself? Using only medicines you could produce for yourself? Some critics of capitalism or advocates of back to nature, like the Unabomber, or to be fair, like Al Gore, if he really meant what he wrote in his book, might believe in such a thing. But no normal person and no libertarian wants to renounce the benefits of the Great Society. Of course we want a complex society made possible by social interaction. A system of property rights, the rule of law, and minimal government allows maximum scope for people to interact, to cooperate, and to develop new forms of cooperation. We can barely survive and hardly flourish without interacting with other people. And all of the associations that we form with other people, businesses, condominium associations, churches, charities, garden clubs, all of those things make up what we call civil society. And Friedrich Hayek made the point that the associations within civil society all have a purpose. The Smith Foundation has a purpose. The Cato Institute has a purpose. The Ford Motor Company has a purpose. The Republican Party has a purpose, though it is hard to define what it is. But civil society itself doesn't have a purpose. It just exists to allow other people to interact. And that's a common mistake on both left and right, to believe that society has a common purpose, that everyone in the city or the state or the nation has a common goal, when what you really mean is that you want your goal imposed on everyone else. Life would indeed be nasty, brutish, and short if it were solitary. Fortunately, it isn't. So competition and cooperation are not a binary choice. They're both part of the simple system of natural liberty. The implication of the need for cooperation and competitive systems is limited government in which free people can find the best ways to compete and to cooperate. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each one of us is the best person to make the important decisions about our own lives. What to think, what to read, what kind of family to create, where to send our children to school, where to invest our retirement savings, how to give to the less fortunate. Limited constitutional government protects those choices, and that's the government a free society should have. In short, if you think freedom is important, then Smokey the Bear's rules for fire safety apply to government. Keep it small, keep it in a confined area, and keep an eye on it. Thank you very much.
Well, I tried to keep track of many of the points that Mr. Boaz made, and one of the very first was that there should be a presumption for liberty as opposed to power. And I do agree with that. The difficulty with that formulation is that freedom involves us being free from the power not just of government, but also the power of other individuals. Individuals do not have the right to wrongfully harm each other. That's not an exercise of freedom, that's an exercise of wrongful harm, of license. And much of what government does, the regulations that it adopts, are regulations that define what wrongful harm is. That is what you don't have the freedom to do, where you're exercising power as opposed to freedom. So in my view, the idea of power, which certainly does come secondary, but it's inherent in the carrying out of freedom to determine what is freedom as opposed to what is wrongful harm, and to developing those definitions, which only society can do, or either through regulation or through common law, one way or another. Another point that he makes is about how wonderful a spontaneous order is. And I agree, spontaneous orders are wonderful unless they create harm to individuals. And when the individuals can't do anything about that harm, that begins to look a little bit like they are imposing on the freedom of at least some individuals. And when, in a spontaneous order, such as a free market, individuals are not able to get the benefit of their work, that is a big problem of freedom. That is a big problem of the very premise upon which freedom is based. Because if you try to say, well, why should freedom be something we value? I think we value it because we have a premise of the inherent dignity of every human being. When you start from that premise, you then end up with the kinds of things that I spoke to you about in my opening remarks. For example, that individuals have a right to the fruits of their labor. That, by the way, is a natural right, and understandably so. And to protect that right is a proper role of government. And when Mr. Boaz says, well, the Constitution doesn't really say that, I look around and I see all of these programs, many of which I mentioned, such as the minimum wage or the earned income tax credit, and it seems like most of the judges in this country for many, many years now have agreed that it is indeed something that the Constitution permits. And there's been very little question about that for much of our lifetimes, if not longer. I do think that there's a common goal that society should have. And that common goal is to advance the morality of freedom, the kind of morality that I've been speaking about here, that is based on the idea of the dignity of each and every person, based on the idea that many of the values that Mr. Boaz himself spoke of, such as that you do not wrongfully harm others, you care for others and not wrongfully harm others. And he's right that freedom is not just an individualistic thing. Freedom is actually about a relationship between individuals, where it is that you have a right to do things as long as you don't harm others. That is the most fundamental definition of freedom. And in that definition, it involves a relationship between individuals, not simply the individual, him or herself. Thank you.
Professor Schwarz talks about the inherent dignity of every individual, and I absolutely agree that that lies at the heart of a free society. It lies at the heart of the case for freedom. But he wants to tax half of us hugely, hugely more than we're taxed today, to give huge amounts of money to the other half or the other quarter. So he would have half of us, maybe 3/4, work most of the year and have the money that we produce taken away from us, and he would have the other quarter, the other half, become bound in a network of obligations to government, to be trapped in a web of dependency. I don't think that you're enhancing the dignity of either the taxpayers or the tax recipients when you do that. I think that we've seen what welfare does to people's lives. We've seen that it becomes a multi-generational form of dependency. I don't think that is helping the dignity of the people who go on programs like that. And I don't think it respects the dignity of each individual who produces in society to tax that person's substance away. Professor Schwarz talks about an individual's not being able to get the value of their work. I think that's what a market produces. And I talked about a market as a spontaneous order. One of the implications of that is that it's more complicated than I or Professor Schwarz can understand. And I can look around the world and say, why does Britney Spears make more money than a professor at the University of Arizona? Isn't that unfair? Shouldn't we do something about that? That's wrong. The problem is, if I say that, I'm trying to say that I know more than the collective judgments of 300 million people. For better or worse, more people are willing to pay money to see Britney Spears perform than are willing to pay money to see most professors perform. Now, that may be a bad thing at some moral level, but at the level of social organization and at the level of freedom, that is people choosing what to do with their own money. And it's not just Britney Spears and professors, it's every participant in the market. I would have to think that I am smarter than the entire market economy, all the price signals, all the choices, if I know that some people are being paid less than the value of their work. I think in a market, people tend to get what they're worth. Now, Britney Spears might be an exception. There are going to be exceptions, but I don't think there are massive exceptions. I also think that we should keep in mind the results of the free market. The United States and the other countries in the world that have relatively free markets have created unprecedented wealth. Not just for Bill Gates, not even just for Professor Schwarz and me, but for everybody. Unprecedented wealth. A lot of times I think pundits and professors walk outside of here and they look around and they say, what causes poverty? That is the wrong question. Nothing causes poverty. Poverty is the natural condition of the world. The question is what causes wealth? What causes abundance? What causes prosperity? And the answer is the free market, which is freedom. Capitalism is what happens when you let people alone. When you let people alone, they start trading, they start building, they start looking for better ways to do it. I have fish and you have apples, and eventually you have a skyscraper and I have a computer program that costs me virtually nothing. And that system has brought unprecedented prosperity to all the people of the United States. You know, there's a new website where you can find out how rich you are. And you can go in, enter your income, and it will tell you in the world how rich are you. If you're Bill Gates, you would go type in $100 million a year, and it would say, congratulations, you are the first richest person in the world. And if you're somebody on Wall Street, it might say, congratulations, you are the 1,000th richest person in the world. For me, it was like, you are the 600 millionth richest person in the world, which is not bad considering the size of the world. And one of the things I noticed was if you enter the income of a minimum wage worker in the United States, not two minimum wage workers, which is the way most households would be at the minimum wage, one person making the minimum wage is richer than 87% of the people in the world. Now, we can still feel that that is a bad thing, that he's as poor as he is in a city as wealthy as New York. But it's the system of markets that has gotten us to that level that people can live better than the kings of China did. Poor people today have access to more resources than the Vanderbilts did in a lot of ways. Not houses as big, but boy, no poor person would want to trade for the medical attention that a Vanderbilt got in 1900. So the kind of wealth that we've produced has produced that. Professor Schwarz says the goal of the free market is efficiency, not freedom. I don't think that's true. I wouldn't say the goal of the free market is freedom. The free market simply is freedom. But it's a system. It's a spontaneous order. It doesn't really have a goal. The free market is what happens when you let people alone. Efficiency is one of the things you get, but I wouldn't call it the goal. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. I have a few questions I'd like to ask as well. Mr. Boaz, just to pick up on the point you ended on, according to Professor Schwarz, the libertarian conception of liberty lacks a moral dimension because it assumes that people will often be treated as the means to an end rather as an end in themselves. Is your concept of freedom one in which morality is absent, or is that a caricature of your view?
Well, I think that would be a caricature. There's a difference in kinds of morality. I think it is absolutely a moral claim to say that the dignity of the individual requires that, to put it in simplest form, you're not allowed to hit him or take his stuff. That's morality. You can't take people's stuff, including their life and their body. But it is a minimal morality. I would not want to live among people who only believed in the libertarian morality of freedom. Because I would hope that if I lived with a spouse, he or she would have other values like love and compassion and fairness. I would hope that if I had neighbors, the neighbors would want to pick up my newspaper, drive me to the hospital when I need it. I would hope that my co-workers would respect my achievements and my contribution. And all of those things are forms of morality. What I disagree is that any morality beyond this minimal morality of respecting each other's rights should be imposed on us by force. And that's why I reject the religious right morality that says it's wrong to use marijuana, so we're going to arrest you if you do. That's why I reject their morality when they say it's wrong to be gay, so we'll throw you in jail if you have sex with a person of the same sex. And I also reject the secular or religious left morality that says it's wrong not to give half your income to the poor, so we're going to throw you in jail if you don't. Because that's what it means to say we want these massive transfers. It means we will throw you in jail if you don't. People talk about the common good, sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left. I think the common good, the one we can actually all agree on, is that we should all be free to pursue our own purposes, not just our own interest in a financial sense, but our own purposes, whether that's Mother Teresa's purpose or Donald Trump's purpose.
Well, let me push you on that a little bit. Realistically, if you mentioned you would hope that you live next to people who respect your rights and respect your property and so forth and your person, but what if that doesn't happen?
No, that's not what I said. I expect to live next door to people who respect my rights, and we do have police and courts to ensure that they do. And that's the minimal morality that I think should be enforced by law. I would hope to live next door to people who would also pick up my newspaper when I'm gone and drive me to the hospital and watch my kids when they're in the street. And that's not protecting my rights. That's something beyond rights
Well,
protection.
I guess where I was going with that is, don't you very soon in the complex world of exchange that you've described, don't you very quickly get to the point where you also need people to inspect the contracts, make sure the food is not adulterated, do all of the other things that would make a system of free exchange work properly?
Oh, I think most of those things can be handled on the market. I don't know how many people here would like to buy uninspected food. I certainly would prefer to see a good housekeeping seal of approval or an underwriter's laboratory seal, and those things don't come with requirement of government. You know, Charles Murray in his book proposed a regulatory system that would say you can either submit to a system of regulation or you can hang on your door a sign that says unregulated. And unregulated by the government. And his suggestion was that private systems of inspection and regulation would be so much more efficient that people would actually prefer to opt out of the government regulatory system, use the private system, and customers would choose that because they would still be protected. So most of those things I don't think the government needs to do.
Let me ask, I have a question for you, Professor Schwarz. This is a quote from the syndicated column of Pat Buchanan this week. And I'm quoting, "Americans are not driven by some ideological vocation to reform mankind. We do not have the patience or perseverance of great imperial peoples. If an issue is not seen as vital to our own liberty and security, we will not fight long for some abstraction like democracy, self-determination, or human rights." Does he have a point when he says that? And is that what we're seeing in the growing public discontent over Iraq?
Well, speaking of Iraq, I think Americans have a very hard time keeping track with what the rationale is this day and this week for being in Iraq. And a main rationale for being there certainly is not one of the morality of freedom, where you never impose democracy at the point of a gun. Or try to impose freedom at the point of a gun. But the main reason to be there now is, from the standpoint of freedom, is asking the question. We created a situation that is potentially going to harm many, many people probably more so than the situation under Saddam Hussein. Now, we don't know what Saddam Hussein would have done, of course, and he's done some awful things in the way past. Maybe he would have done some awful things in the future that's even worse than what we can contemplate in Iraq today. But under the supposition that we have created this situation, we have an obligation under freedom to do something about that, not to simply leave it, unless that route is what we would consider a route that would minimally cause harm. It's hard to rally a population behind this kind of principle that I'm speaking about here. It would have been much easier to rally people if there had been a cause to begin with that was a just cause under the morality of freedom in the first place, and that kind of cause I think Americans will rally behind for long periods of time if they understand it in those terms.
Well, on that question of rallying the public behind your concept of freedom, what if citizens, and I hear some of this behind what Mr. Boaz is saying, what if citizens for whatever reason don't want to sign on to the project? The famous formulation by Brandeis of the privacy right, the right to be left alone, how does that figure into your theory?
Oh, I think it's a very important right, the right to be left alone. That's why I mentioned as one example the governmental surveillance of Americans without warrants. That's an issue of privacy. So freedom is I think Mr. Boaz put this well, freedom is the context in which we do many other things. We have all sorts of other values that we care about, and we lead our lives within the context and framework of freedom. And I'm simply wanting us to understand that freedom is a very rich and powerful moral framework, moral philosophy. Within that framework, which includes privacy, very much so, we lead our lives.
Mr. Boaz, I want to tease out something that's in Professor Schwartz's book. He suggests that that self-interest and the drive for accumulation, the very engine of market exchange in many ways, will inevitably run afoul of a limit that was suggested by John Locke, that people have the right to accumulate as much as they can, provided they leave, quote, as much and as good behind for their neighbor, which is interpreted in the book as meaning opportunity. Is that limit acceptable to you? Does that interfere with freedom?
They call that the Lockean proviso. It's a pretty standard basic piece of Western philosophy and of the case for private property. A lot of people read that paragraph, but they don't read the next paragraph. Because in the next paragraph, Locke says, and privately owned land is so much more productive than collectively owned land that he that privatizes and produces on 1 acre of land, it is as if he has returned to the community 9 more acres of land. That is how much of a benefactor he is to society. So the answer is, you cannot dream of, you cannot imagine having a society of 300 million Americans or 8 million New Yorkers if you didn't have private property and market exchange. So no, I think we have in effect not just left enough and as good. Imagine what that would mean. It would mean leaving all the people of New York with access to a common field of clover. No, we have left to the people of New York skyscrapers and housing and restaurants and all those things. So, I think it's an interesting intellectual construct to imagine an early world, but Locke himself understood that privatization and private property would lead to the flourishing of everyone.
Notice in his answer that he speaks only about material things. He speaks only about our wealth, and there's no question that we are far more wealthy because of a private market. And by the way, freedom, the private market is very important in any morality of freedom. I certainly acknowledge that, but there are limits to what the private market can do. In any case, he speaks only of private of wealth, And what he is ignoring is that at the beginning, people also had a way of getting inclusion, of feeling included in the society that they were in, because they were able to provide for themselves in a manner that was fairly similar to everybody else. It's this kind of a thing, this right of inclusion, that has to be kept. That's part of enough and is good, is the opportunity to attain inclusion. And also, another thing they had at the time, by the way, was the right to get the fruits of their labor, because what they produced is what they got. And so that's another area that would need to be a part of this proviso. And so people can own as much property as they want, no problem, as long as there's enough opportunity for everybody such that they can live a minimally, through their labor, live a minimally dignified life and be able to improve their living by improving their labor. As long as that is open to each and every person, which is what the idea of the dignity of every person means. As long as that's open to them, wealth can be distributed as unequally as happens. But those things have to be left open.
But how do you define minimally decent? The minimally decent standard you're talking about can't be the minimally decent standard in India. It can't be the minimally decent standard in America in 1900, or even America in 1950, or I guess America in 1970. So just how close to the average income is required to be minimally decent?
Well, I agree that there are matters of definition, but the first thing you do is you look at the society that you're in. You don't look at India and you don't look at America in 1850. But I have to say something about the poverty line here. The poverty line doesn't look at today. The poverty line looks at 1955 in this country. The poverty line is based on the level of living, not of 2006, but of 1955. That's why it's so far off, and I'm sure many of you realize that living on $19,000 a year for a family of four is that which is what the poverty line is for a family of four is not feasible. So I agree that and that's a subject for debate, but at least we're debating now about what opportunity has to be rather than denying it and acting as if it isn't an issue at all.
It's a question for Mr. Boaz. In Freedom Reclaimed, John Schwarz writes that, and I'm quoting, "The free market view is so deeply morally flawed that it cannot provide us with a philosophy we find compelling or meaningful." You've talked about free markets, and in many libertarian writings, you hear it promoted as an alternative to some form of tyranny or unfair restriction, but what's inherently compelling and meaningful about libertarianism, would you say?
Well, I think it is inherently compelling and meaningful to say that it is wrong to use force to impose your values on others, and both the right and the left want to do that. Libertarians defend the individual and his or her right to pursue his or her own purposes. And you know, when you talk about a morality that is not compelling, I read Professor Schwartz's book, and I find phrases in it like larger meaning, genuine freedom, our collective life as a nation, common higher public purpose, unifying bonds connecting us all together, rich fabric of obligations we have toward the collective society. At some level, these are beautiful words. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all felt this way? But the truth is that these are the phrases that have been used in every attempt throughout history to snuff out liberty wherever it has appeared. And I think it is appalling to think that these are the phrases that will lead you to freedom and not to Robespierre. You do not get freedom when you start talking about how there is a higher meaning and a collective life of the nation that is more important and deeper and more moral than each individual pursuing his own purposes and his own goals. We are never going to have a common goal of 300 million Americans except in time of war. And that's why it is so remarkable how many social democrats, how many self-professed liberals end up liking wartime. And I could give you chapter and verse of great liberals like Michael Foot, the former leader of the Labor Party of Great Britain. Let me just finish this sentence. Who said his ideal of the Britain he envisioned as the head of the Labor Party was Britain during World War II, when we all had a common goal. Yes, not being killed by the Nazis, that's a pretty clear common goal. But outside wartime, we don't have a common goal.
When I speak about that we have obligations to each other, I do that to remind us that freedom involves a lot of obligations that we have to each other, and you've mentioned some of them. You don't have the right to wrongfully harm another. That's an obligation. That means taking another person into consideration. There are many things like that in the idea of freedom. We have an obligation, for example, to respect a vote where each of us has an equal vote. I can tell you dozens of these kinds of obligations, and they are all connected to freedom. They are not because of the collective society per se. They are because that is what is involved in operating morally under the idea of freedom, with the idea of freedom in mind. Not that there's some collective societal goal other than the goal of individual freedom. That is what, when I talk about a goal of society, I mean advancing the goal of individual freedom, not some sort of collectivist goal. And that's what liberals are all about.
I'm going to let that be the last word. And I'd like to thank Demos Senior Fellow John Schwarz, the author of Freedom Reclaimed, for joining us tonight, along with Cato Institute Executive Vice President David Boaz. And I'd like to thank Demos, the Donald and Paula Smith Family Foundation, and the Cato Institute for making this event possible. This will be televised on CUNY TV, and you'll be informed of the air dates. And thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.